Now, we need some way by which we're going to allocate the scarce doctor's time to the patients that want to see the doctor. Remember, there's only so many doctors in the world, and there's only so many hours in the day. And so there is a limit to how many patients can be seen by the doctors per day. And that limit is a hard constraint. We cannot go above it without either adding in new doctors or creating time. Now, if we could create time, that'd be quite the feat. We might be able to create doctors, but not in the short run. Okay, so one way to do this would be to have the buyers rank themselves. So let's suppose that no doctor's offices take appointments and that it's all based on a first come, first served basis. What will happen? Well, let's suppose that the doctor's office opens up at 8 o'clock. Are people going to wait until 8 o'clock to get there? Or will they get to the doctor's office early? My guess would be that we would see people in line outside of every single doctor's office as early as 6 a.m., possibly even earlier. Okay? So what's happening here is people are forming a queue or a line. Right? Q-U-E. Right? We're queuing up to go see the doctor, and the person who waits the longest is the one who gets to see the doctor first. Now, we see this in the US all the time. Remember, we have a tradition called Black Friday, which is the day after Thanksgiving, where several big-name stores announce pretty big discounts on things like TVs, computers, and video game consoles. If people stand in line outside of, for example, Best Buy for hours to get a TV that they probably don't really need, what do you think they're going to be willing to do for doctor's visits with this kind of a discount? My guess is they're going to wait there for a long, long time, as long as it possibly takes. So in this way, buyers are actually ranking themselves according to how long they're willing to wait. The only way to move ahead in the line is to get there before everyone else. Unfortunately, this means standing outside for long periods of time. Even more dramatically, we see people stampede the door once the door opens. Have you ever heard of people being trampled to death during Black Friday over, say, a TV or a child's toy? Or peeing their pants so that the smell of stale urine keeps other potential customers further away? What do you think it's going to be like at the doctor's office when the good in question is medical care and not just like a doll or a video game or a television? My guess is that the form of competition of buyers among buyers is going to be far more ruthless than it is at places like Best Buy, Walmart, and Target. So, how can we figure out what the cost of that time is? Well, we can look at the demand curve, because remember, the demand curve represents the maximum willingness to pay for these customers. And so this cost is usually depicted in dollars, but remember, everyone has an opportunity cost. Everyone could, in principle, be earning some number of dollars every single hour. And so what we can do is we can recognize that time is equal to money, at least to an extent, or at least it's valuable in some way. And so what ends up happening is we come straight up here and come straight over, and this will get us the full cost of this $10 medical services. So we'll pay $10 in terms of money, but we'll pay whatever this is. So let's say in this case, it's higher than 500, so let's call it 600. What we're paying here is $10 in money and $590 in time. And so in this way, lowering the monetary cost, yes, it does lower the monetary cost, but it raises the full cost because people will wait in line to the point where they are paying their full cost or their full willingness to pay for this good. This is why lines don't last forever. So for example, everyone knows that there's going to be a new iPhone coming out sometime in the fall. We don't see people standing in line outside the Apple Store right now. And that makes sense because we know that we're not going to have to wait this long, right? We're filming this in March 15th, 2021. There's no way that we're going to have people standing outside of an Apple Store all May, all June, all July, all August, all September, all October into November, so that they can make sure that they're the first person in line so that they can get the brand new iPhone. Okay? So we know there's an upper limit on how much time people will spend in line, but there's also a lower limit, which would be 0. And we know that if you roll up to the doctor's office, in this case, right when the doctor's office opens, there's going to be a long line. Now, we refer to all of this as a deadweight loss to society. It's a loss because clearly the people who are in line, well, their time is valuable. But the doctor's office doesn't receive any of that valuable time in any way. And so this area here, right, this whole area right here is the full cost of the time. Right, this is the full cost of the time spent in line. This right here is the total revenue that they take in money. Right, so this is revenue in money. Okay. And then we actually even have a third deadweight loss triangle, because here, this shape here, is also a deadweight loss, because those are trades that would have occurred if it weren't for this $10 price ceiling. If the price ceiling were lifted and the price were allowed to rise to $500, the quantity supplied would increase. And that means that the quantity demanded, in this case, would also, the quantity actually purchased would increase as well, giving more people better access to medical care. Okay? So ironically, by raising the money price of this good back to its equilibrium price, the total cost, or the full cost, actually comes down. Think of it this way. Have you ever stood in line to, say, buy groceries? What if you were allowed to pay a quarter and skip ahead to the front of the line, and that it was socially acceptable for you to do so? Would you do it? Well, almost certainly. How much would you be willing to pay to jump to the front of the line, though? So what we're establishing here is that there exists some number of dollars that you would be willing to pay in order to save yourself some time. So rather than let the buyers rank themselves and waste all of that time standing in line, what if instead we let the sellers rank the buyers? For example, what if the sellers are actually not indifferent to any two buyers, as in they would rather sell to certain people than other people? First, this sounds awful. What kind of society would allow sellers to pick and choose which buyers they sell to? You could sell perhaps only to your friends, right? Clearly there's no problems with that ever, right? That's called nepotism, and we generally look down on it in this society. The most heinous form of choice among buyers that sellers could engage in would be called discrimination, and it would be to discriminate along attributes that cannot be modified by the potential customer. For example, sex, ethnicity, race, and other physical attributes. Let's be real. Whether we want to admit it or not, things like racism and sexism still exist in this world. By restricting how high the price of something can be, it becomes cheaper for people to, as economists phrase it, consume their ignorant preferences. As a result, racism and sexism are at their highest in markets where prices are set the lowest. Now, let's do a non-ist example. So suppose that a landlord wants to rent an apartment in a rent-controlled area. So again, we have our familiar supply and demand graph here, where the price ceiling is set below the equilibrium price. Okay, so this introduces a difference between the amount of rent, or the amount of apartments that people want to rent, the quantity demanded, and the amount of apartment space that is actually existing, the quantity supplied. Now, this landlord wants to rent an apartment to a tenant in a rent-controlled area, and he gets two applications, let's say. One is from some smokers, and one is from some non-smokers. Smokers, as you probably could understand, impose costs on the landlord in that the smell of smoke can be very difficult to actually abate. Would the landlord in this scenario be likely to rent to smokers? Well, almost certainly not. But if the smokers were allowed to offer a higher price to the landlord in order to pay for smoke abatement, or more accurately, if the landlord were allowed to charge a higher price due to the cost of smoke abatement, then the smokers would have an easier time getting an apartment than they would if they were not allowed to offer higher prices. And this gets at a really important point in economics. None of us would deny that if prices were lower and everything were plentiful, everyone would have a very good time. But the question is always about realistic alternatives. Do smokers have a hard time finding an apartment? Yes, they do. As a result, most smokers tend to pay more for rent because doing so encourages renters to actually rent to them. And so, if you prevent smokers from being able to offer higher prices to offset the cost of smoke abatement to the landlords, all that ends up happening is it becomes harder and harder for smokers to find an apartment given the constraints of the real world. So, if the goal is to lower prices, and by that we mean the full or total prices, then legally mandating lower dollar prices seems like a means that would not achieve the end. Instead, what actually does work is twofold. One would be allowing prices to be flexible. And then the second one, as we kind of discussed last week, is allowing entry into the market. Let's compare and contrast a market with a price ceiling to a market without one in the context of an increase in demand.